I guess it didn't happen. I'll just leave it at that. Where I requested time, you must have just been incredibly tight with time, because I think it was after Neighbor, and I think that was the one I asked for. I think I just wrote the publicist. I don't remember who it was, but they usually accommodate. They usually accommodate. So
it just depends on time.
Nice. Yeah, it's not like there's a shortage of guests, but it's nice to bring on somebody like yourself.
So we're going to record this as a straight podcast?
Yeah. So just
so I know.
Caution.
So we're going.
Proceed cautiously if you don't want to be trashing everybody here like Mr. Rogers or something. So we can talk about that.
Sure.
And its likely nominations and all that. I think it's going to... All right, maybe that's not... Maybe that's bad form.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm superstitious.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. It's like the Jewish tradition of not naming your child until they're born.
Yeah, I would be... If I was Jewish, I'd be that person.
Right. Never too late.
Yeah.
And then, of course, even more recently, we could talk about They'll Love Me When I'm Dead.
Sure.
Which I caught up with as well. So I actually went to the movies and saw Won't You Be My Neighbor. I went to the movies.
That's great.
It wasn't like some free screening. It was
you actually paid.
No,
okay.
but
still,
it was at the Alamo Draft House, a great place to see that movie.
Yeah, and they were handing out Kleenex, I heard, at the Alamo Draft House. At least
that's funny.
Certain branches of the Alamo Draft House actually had packets of Kleenex in the lobby.
Yeah, I could have used them. Definitely, everybody, if they have an emotional capacity to feel, they would have at some point teared up during that movie.
Yeah, I would think, but I didn't know that going in.
Right.
I honestly didn't.
You didn't set out to make a very sentimental film. That's not what you do.
No, and it's not. The film is not actually nostalgic per se,
right?
And it's not overly sentimental. I think about this quote that Roger Ebert said, that he was much more moved by goodness than sadness, and it's this kind of other sense of goodness that is an interesting kind of emotional trigger for me. I mean, it was making the film, and it's something I responded to, but I had no idea until really our first screening at Sundance, when the entire audience broke out sobbing, that I said, wow, what's happening here? Like, it just had this reaction that never stopped. And that was something I really didn't fully anticipate.
I wonder if also, as you speak about Fred Rogers' goodness, which he seemed to have a very huge capacity of, but I wonder if also the context of what we've been living through in this country specifically, the last couple of years, if it doesn't heighten the experience of watching that guy at that time.
Without a doubt.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and the timing of a film is something you can't completely control, and I started thinking about making this film at the end of 2015.
Yeah.
Before the last election. However, the ideas that civility and civil discourse is under threat is something that's been going on for a very, very long time. It's just that much more acute now.
Right.
I mean, I feel like my film Best of Enemies actually deals with a lot of the same issues.
Oh, right, because it was kind of the start of that in the big media world.
Exactly, and it's also a film about television and its role as a meeting place, as a force for good or for bad, in our civil discourse. So it's definitely an issue I'm very interested in, but I didn't anticipate just how necessary it was going to feel by the time the film actually came out. And it's interesting because I feel like it's something that, we've built this culture that incentivizes incivility, that basically you get elected or you get, ratings by pitting people against one another, fear-mongering, all the kind of resentment politics, all the stuff we're living through. And that's all predicated on this belief that the center will hold. And I think that is a fool's errand. I think we're on a very dangerous road where there's nobody left advocating for cooperation, civility, civil discourse, long-term thinking. There are no grown-ups anymore. I mean, these are the kinds of things I've been saying for years and have been kind of obsessed about. And that's why I responded so strongly to Fred Rogers when I kind of came back and started thinking about him again. I was like, well, this is the advocate. This is somebody who's actually talking about a lot of the things that I believe in very deeply that people have stopped advocating for.
I wonder, there's this one moment in "Won't You Be My Neighbor," the documentary we're talking about, where he's at a hearing, isn't he?
Yeah,
or is he
a Senate
hearing, which is again, the timing is a bit just funny.
Yeah.
It's just great because we've just watched the Kavanaugh hearings and the cruelty and the grandstanding and all that, and then to watch that hearing, also is shocking. And I'm so glad Rogers. Well, it's hard to say this, but I'm glad he's not here to see this in a way. That's how much I feel for him. It's like I wouldn't want him to. I don't know that he could have had any success today if he had gone into a hearing.
I think what would have happened today is people would have acted very moved, and then behind closed doors, they would have gutted the funding.
Yeah. Anyway,
that's what happens now. Is it's
Lies.
all show, and
Right.
there's no real minds are ever made up because I feel like we live in a culture where everybody's mind is made up by their tribe already.
Right.
What everybody's going to think about every issue, certainly every politician.
Mm-hmm. So do you have that trouble then? Since you brought that up, do you have trouble then piercing through that, or is Mr. Rogers so ubiquitous and so beloved across the board?
One thing I really gravitated towards about him, not just kind of personally as somebody who grew up with him, but he's somebody who reaches everybody across the spectrum, because those of us who grew up watching him watched him before we had a sense of tribalism. We didn't watch him as Democrats and Republicans. We watched him before we had those labels, and so a lot of what he's doing is trying to explain to children how to behave as people. This is how you treat other people. This is how you treat yourself. This is what a neighborhood or a community or a society is supposed to be based upon, a sense of kind of mutual respect and responsibility. And I feel like these are first principles of how things should work that nobody talks about anymore. And I think it was an opportunity to reach people who I don't agree with politically. Here's somebody who was a minister. He was a Republican. There are many, many people who went and saw this film who felt like it spoke to them, who I don't think share my politics. But I feel like, and maybe, I don't know if this is, too naive to think that the fact that if we can at least talk about the kind of the need to have a common core of joint responsibilities and just a sense of what we owe each other, that's something we can build upon. That I feel like there's a core group of people, the center in America, who's basically been ignored. And it's been ignored by how our politics and how our PACs and how our media and how everything basically plays to the polls, and nobody plays to the center anymore. And I think there's a huge amount of agreement in the center about what kind of culture we should have and how we should treat each other.
So who's missing from there? Because I don't know. I think most of the left that I hear would like to have engaged, but feels. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the far left.
No,
maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
I feel. I absolutely agree. I think there are people that have tried.
Yeah.
But like I said, I feel like it's not even about individuals. It's about these institutions that that are now predicated upon division.
Media being one of them.
Media being a huge one. But following media then is politics. But even, and that's whether it's identity politics or any kind of politics like that. I think it's all about, establishing a sense of us and them, and some sense of the other. And I feel like if we can try and build a sense of kind of common core principles that, or at least to acknowledge the fact that we live in a culture that is broken, that we have these institutions that are broken. And rather than supporting wildly irresponsible leaders because they're different, we should maybe take a look in the mirror and decide the more responsible thing to do, which is try and act grown up for once. We're an infantilized culture where everybody just wants instant gratification, whether it's companies, whether it's politicians, everybody. And it's the most unhealthy thing in the world. There's, I keep reading articles about it, and you look at other cultures that have a kind of a greater sense of time and future. You know, I feel like America is just a country of amnesiacs.
Well said, yeah. Well, the film's now available on, right?
iTunes and...
on most of those major streaming platforms, what have you.
Yep.
When you went into it, what were the first steps in order to kind of get a documentary about Fred Rogers?
The first steps were getting the kind of permission.
Right.
What's
that Fred Rogers estate? Who's that?
So, it's actually a little complicated. There's a wife and the kids.
Is the wife alive?
Yeah, Joanne.
She's in the film.
Yeah, she's in the film. She's amazing.
Right.
I just saw her a couple weeks ago.
Okay.
She's still doing great. And the estate is both kind of the company that owns the shows, and it's a foundation that actually gives away money, but they actually own his the songs and his personal letters and words. Then there's a Fred Rogers Center that's for education and research, which is
Where's that located?
That is in Latrobe, Pennsylvania.
Uh-huh.
And we basically had to get everybody on board. And the pitch was, we want to make a film about ideas. That it isn't a biography.
He's sort of the navigator. He's sort of
He is. And he had these, an incredibly enlightened way of thinking about things. And it's...
Yeah.
And a lot of things that we take for granted now, or we now discuss, things like mindfulness and emotional maturity and slow culture. These things that now exist that he was doing 50 years ago, he intuitively knew how valuable these things were. And, I feel in some way we've caught up to him. In other ways, we still haven't caught up to him in a lot of the things he was doing. Certainly in how he's dealing with kind of leveling with kids about these incredibly difficult things that go on that nobody else does to this day, kind of helping kids process the world, which is, so much of what he was trying to do was basically help kids figure out how to love and how not to fear. I think those were like the two most important things.
Yeah.
Love on the one hand and fear, because I think he saw fear as the great toxic force in our culture, because fear leads to bigotry and resentment and hatred and all these things.
Sure.
And the kids are fearful because they don't know how the world works. But the reality is adults are fearful. We swallow our fear and it metastasizes into things like bigotry and hatred.
Yeah.
I think as a culture, we don't acknowledge and process.
Maybe that was the big draw with Trump. People will say that they just wanted to change, but really it's very hard to choose somebody like Barack Obama, who actually demands from us a level of maturity, which obviously his successor doesn't. Quite the opposite. So it's like this is people gravitate towards that because that's because we're afraid. I don't know.
If you look at hope on the one hand and fear on the other, there's no doubt we live in an administration ruled by fear.
Right. Oh, absolutely right.
That's how they appealed to our basest instincts.
Yeah.
And that kind of resentment, stoking resentment endlessly. And it's powerful. Humans are wired for it. And
that's right. Yeah.
It's a lot easier to scare somebody than to make them stand up and do something positive. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, pretty much what I'm trying to say.
And I get that. The things I keep coming back to are, when I look at kind of the major institutions in our country, the church, where are they in inspiring hope and love and understanding rather than sowing fear? I see a lot of fear and resentment going on in our, religious community in America. Not everywhere, of course, but if you just look at kind of the numbers, it's frightening. And you look at what I see a lot of evangelicals doing. I just don't understand how it resonates with what their purpose is. Jesus. Obviously, Fred, as a minister, was somebody who was largely informed. His religious underpinnings were a lot of what informed what he brought to the show. It's not a big leap to go from "won't you be my neighbor" to "love thy neighbor." That
he was a New Testament guy.
Yeah, absolutely. And he actually studied the other religions. He actually learned Hebrew and studied Judaism and Islam and Buddhism, and he was kind of looking for the common tenets of how all those religions say we should treat other people.
Again, the exact opposite of what we're doing now.
Exactly.
We're cascading further into our own tribe.
But the thing I don't get is this kind of selective morality. That this that certain religious people are motivated by one or two issues, and I don't think Christ would have agreed with that kind of moral relativism. Mm-hmm. You're either loving and believe something consistently. You don't just say, well, on this issue, I'll forgive everything else because I really believe in this one issue. Mm-hmm. I find that incredibly unchristian. Mm-hmm. I find that really toxic, and I think Fred would too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you obviously got past with the idea.
Yeah.
Idea.
So going back to the story.
Well, I'm just our
pitch was we want to make this film about ideas, and that the world really never understood Fred. I think that's what they appreciated about what we were doing, is you see Fred's own frustration with people not understanding the depth of what he was trying to do. So in a way, I think they appreciated that. Our pitch was that you have to trust us to make this film, and you can't control it at all. Mm-hmm. And they had never given permission for anybody to do anything like this for decades. And my producer, Nicholas Ma, who is Yo-Yo's son and had known them forever, he has known the family, and he actually really helped.
Yo-Yo Ma was on...
he was on the show.
Or did they collaborated, correct?
They became friends.
Okay.
They actually met early on when Yo-Yo was playing at the Pittsburgh Symphony, and Fred was a huge classical music fan, and they became friends. Then Fred went on the Yo-Yo went on the show, and actually Nicholas went on the show as a 6-year-old. There's a clip out there of our producer playing piano with his dad, Yo-Yo.
Well, I got to ask, because of course we know from a prior episode of this podcast that you've done a documentary on Yo-Yo Ma about a project that he was involved with.
Yeah.
The Silk Road Project.
The Silk Road Project, which is kind of what led to this project.
Did you hire or collaborate with Nicholas, is that his name? Nicholas Ma, as a result of that? Or did you already know him?
I got to know him then.
And then that led to...
And
he
Nicholas,
was a producer?
Yeah, Nicholas is a filmmaker, and he and I had been working on some other projects.
Okay.
And then... I got to know him by doing the Music of Strangers.
Sure. Right.
And I also got to think about Fred Rogers doing that, because Yo-Yo would talk about Fred Rogers. And every time he did, it kind of blew my mind. It was like not what I expected. I was like, he sounds like a badass. Like when Yo-Yo would talk about him, he'd say we'd have these deep conversations about, the other F word, fame, and kind of how to use that force, how to jiu-jitsu that force into doing something positive in the world with it, rather than letting it become a toxic force. And I just thought, well, that's interesting. That's not what I thought about when I thought about Fred Rogers. And so when I started thinking about doing this show, I called Nicholas early, right in the beginning, and said, is this a crazy idea? And he said, I love that idea. I want to help you make it. So Nicholas really became my kind of emissary into the family and the estate. And once we kind of made our pitch and they thought about it and talked about it, they decided 100% we will trust you. Mm-hmm. So it went from being very kind of closed to being 100% open. We have the archives, we have everything, the letters, so it's just this bounty.
The genie was out of the
stuff.
bottle. Right, yeah.
Yeah. And, as a filmmaker, particularly doing archival films at times, there's nothing better than just this insane trove of material, some of which was organized, a lot of which wasn't organized. Particularly all the old film materials were just boxes and boxes of film from all the field pieces he had done and from his other shows and speeches and letters and, on and on and on.
So this is where the double-edged sword is. Also, now you have all this information, but now you have all this information, all this source material, I
think what helped, though, was that we always had a very clear idea about what we wanted to do with the film.
Right.
That it wasn't just, like I said, it was not a nostalgia piece. So it's not like, let's just talk about all the characters and let's talk about this. It's like,
it will be a nostalgic experience where people grew up on them. It's sort of unavoidable, but it's not the intention of what you were trying to achieve. I understand.
one testament to that, I think, is that I've screened it for audiences abroad that have no idea who he is. And the film plays great.
Yeah.
It plays differently in the beginning because there is no connection to him. But by 20 minutes in, the film plays exactly the same for the rest of the film.
That's great, yeah.
Which is kind of amazing.
It is,
that happens. But because to me, I mean, I'm not... Nostalgia is just... It's like a cheap high. It's like sugar. Again, it's like...
Right. It goes down fun and nice and tasty, but doesn't have any lasting value to it. Or much. Yeah.
Well, I know. I have all my own theories about nostalgia, that it's... I mean, also as somebody who really was trained as a historian and loved history, I feel like, it's the Johnny Rocket syndrome. Like... You don't actually care about the artifact of history, about the authenticity of history. You just care about the simulacra of history. And to me, that I find that infuriating. Anyway, I can go down this rabbit hole of talking about nostalgia.
I understand. Which we should put off for another time, I guess, because I'm kind of interested in that. But in a word, you're saying that the idea is actually to learn right from history and to be able to apply it just in some way to now. That
history can't be reduced. Nostalgia tends to reduce everything.
I see.
And it doesn't ask much from you as a viewer.
Right, okay.
And that history challenges you. It's much more complex, and I felt like, again, these were ideas that are kind of timeless ideas.
Okay, yeah.
And that's and I think it's one thing people have commented on again and again is, oh my God, this show was on 50 years ago. It feels like it's talking about today.
Yeah, sure. Right.
And that's because Fred was dealing in human eternal issues.
Right. And that's what the film was interested in. I got it. Yeah. Right. I understand. Right. So again, it's on iTunes. People can find it quite easily at this stage. And
Amazon and things. And it'll be on TV next year.
You can't say where.
I can't say yet.
No, it's okay.
It'd actually be exciting.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Because it's a new season of Fred Rogers, somehow or other. You've managed to also somehow create... Well, we need them, that's for sure. So hopefully more people as many people need to see this as possible.
Well, thanks.
Sure. You said at one point before, though, timing... The timing is sometimes
you can't control
it all the time. But I was going to say, well, I don't know. Netflix did release, the Love Me When I'm Dead the same day as The Other Side of the Wind. So there, the timing was very specifically controlled. It is in a very, very reductive description a making of documentary. It's more than that, of course. It's about Hollywood in that time, and it's a snapshot as well. But it is a great companion to The Other Side of the Wind, which was finally released by Netflix.
And
a couple weeks
when
ago.
we first conceived of the Love Me When I'm Dead, I read Josh Karp's book, Orson Welles' last movie, and I loved the book.
He's been on the show a number of times.
And Josh is great, and I read the book, and I just kept thinking, oh my God, if I could ever get this footage, I would love to make a film about Orson at the end of his life.
So you're saying is you were already having these thoughts prior to even
resolution. Netflix had nothing to do with
when you read
with getting the film made in the beginning.
Oh right, no, of course there was no such thing.
Was, right. No. I mean, in terms of my documentary.
Okay.
So really, my inspiration came. I mean, even though I was a lifelong Welles fanatic and knew of The Other Side of the Wind, when I read Josh's book, right when it came out, I just thought, God, I would love to get my hands on this footage and make a film. I feel like there's an amazing opportunity because he was making a film about a filmmaker at the end of his life who couldn't finish a film, which is, of course, what ends up happening. And it's the most meta of meta stories.
Yeah.
And I just felt like, God, that would be fun. So I immediately reached out to Josh, and then Josh explained that Frank Marshall and Philip Rimshaw, these two producers, were trying to finally get the footage out. And we kind of made this pact, all of us, that if they could ever get the footage, I would go off and make a documentary, and they would finish the film.
Oh, so what year would that have been?
About 4 years ago.
So you were in there quite early then.
Yeah, I mean,
no
they
idea.
were on it for years and years.
Well,
so
yeah.
I feel like
Well,
I
no,
came
I know.
in.
There were a lot
I'm
of
relatively Johnny-come-lately.
It was for those listening. I mean, I've actually done a few segments now on with Peter Bogdanovich. Even.
Yeah.
But I and Josh came on like a couple weeks ago, one more time to
great.
kind of because he's been on 3 times.
Yeah.
Just over the course of the trajectory of this film story, which I just kind of also enjoyed. And at the first time, probably when you're talking about, which is when I had him on, they were still in the morass, right, of the legal and financial morass. The financial is not really a morass. It's kind of a simple thing.
Yeah.
You have enough money, you can throw at it.
Well,
the problem will
ultimately,
go away.
somebody had to write a monster check.
And that somebody
was Netflix.
That's
and
right,
nobody else was going to write that check.
Yeah.
So, anybody wringing their hands about why Netflix, because that's the only way this film ever would have seen the light of day.
First, there was a short time where Showtime was going to do it.
Showtime and many other people.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, nobody was going to step up in the way that Netflix did.
And I still don't get it. I mean, I'm glad, and it's, kudos. But it seemed to me on some level a PR, like, just a goodwill, a gesture. But I'm thinking, because I can't imagine that the typical Netflix subscriber would grasp this film. And
no, I mean, I think it's definitely... it's not the most mainstream of ideas.
Yeah?
Yet.
The film?
But I feel like there are a couple things about it. I mean, one is that just knowing from having worked with Netflix a fair amount that they're film lovers. A lot of them, are just, they're also big Welles fans. And I think it's part of, if you're sitting on that amount of money and you're producing that amount of content, why not right this historic wrong by writing a check to get the Orson Welles film finished finally. And there's another bit which I believe to be true, and we've talked a bit about it, but Ted Sarandos, who's the head of Netflix, the content.
Heard of him.
That he grew up in Phoenix in the 1970s. And The Other Side of the Wind was being shot and it was a film he had heard about throughout his kind of adolescence.
Yeah, they shot it next door.
Yeah, Carefree to the house from Zabriskie Point.
Zabriskie Point, Antonioni's film, and they blew that house up. And so maybe he would have probably been too young then, but to know about that. But
maybe. The fact that he had heard about this film being shot in Carefree, so in a way, I felt like he had a personal interest in it too.
Okay.
I mean, I know because he was very excited about it. Every time I talked to him about it, he was. This was like, this long lost artifact of his own childhood that he could somehow kind of help put out there in the world. So it felt personal for them.
Okay, yeah. I mean, they obviously did it for a reason. It wasn't financial, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It was like, I'm sure both in you're writing the check and also making the money back wasn't going to come through. Probably there's. I don't know. I mean, well, I guess bring on new subscribers. I guess, maybe they got some new subscribers though as a result of it.
Yeah,
Who knows? You never know.
But it's definitely a different side of them that people don't necessarily think about Netflix for, which is the kind of the classic cineast kind of crowd.
Right. No, that's true. It'd be interesting to because most of the Welles films you would see are probably on the Criterion collection.
Yep, exactly.
You'd see them there. That kind of
and now,
platform
in our post-film struck world.
Well, in about a day or two.
Yeah, I know.
But they'll be available again. That's all getting worked out. I'm sure it's just in a slightly different fashion. But
so just to go back to kind of what was happening. So we wanted to make the film. I wanted to make the film. At that time, they felt like they were very close to closing the deal to get the film. This is before Netflix was even involved. And they ended up pitching the feature film to Netflix. And I got a call from Netflix, from Lisa Nishimura there, saying, I heard you were interested in making a documentary about The Other Side of the Wind. We're interested in finishing The Other Side of the Wind. Can we make your documentary too? And I said, well, do you want to hear the pitch? And she said, no, just send me a budget. I'm like, this is the only time in my life as an independent filmmaker this is ever going to happen. It's like the best call ever. So from that moment, it just the two projects kind of merged into one project. So
this timing is
So originally, I didn't ever think of my film as happening in lockstep with the feature film. And I made the film, if my film would come out a year ago or a year from now, I feel like it would largely play the same way. And what's interesting is so many people watch them back to back. And I feel like there are many good things that happen with that, but it certainly wasn't intended to be that way, that the film, that I felt like, my film, for instance, doesn't mention that the feature film's ever finished.
It doesn't, does it?
No.
Interesting. Yeah.
It leaves it as an unfinished project.
I see.
Because my film really kind of resolves, and I made the decision early on that my film was going to end with Welles's death.
Yes, in 1985, right?
Yeah.
And it does, if you look at the film, the primary source is not The Other Side of the Wind, it's the making of The Other Side of the Wind, Orson Welles' last movie, written by Josh Karp.
Yes.
Who became a producer on your film.
Yeah,
right?
And Josh was hugely helpful.
Oh, I'm sure.
And we had such a great time.
Is that correct? The way I said it, kind of, it does. Did you end up getting all that content because now Netflix owned it? Obviously, the Frank Marshall and what was the other producer? Philip Rimshaw were able to hire the necessary people to edit and do all the post-production on the film.
They did that, but the way it happened is, I get a call 2.5 years later after, so there was this initial kind of sense of a breakthrough with Netflix. It took another 2.5 years of legal wrangling to actually kind of unstick everything that was sticky. It wasn't just a matter of we're going to write a check and we'll be in production tomorrow. That's what everybody thought.
Right.
But the reality is it was 2.5 years where I had doubts as to whether or not the project was actually ever going to happen. And I was in the middle of working on Won't You Be My Neighbor when I get a call saying, guess what?
Green light.
We've got the footage. We're closing the deal. And I didn't really believe it until the footage was out of the vault in Paris and it was sitting in L.A.
Yeah.
And what they did then is they had Mo Henry, this legendary negative cutter, come out of retirement to restore the negative so it could be transferred to Technicolor. And then it came through in these batches, these kind of random batches of footage, because the footage was in a Wellesian manner, not organized in a normal kind of way, and there weren't.
But was there partial edits that had already been seen?
So there was only this kind of 40-minute string out of scenes that Welles himself had cut. And they were working on that, and they were finishing the feature film. We were getting the material when the feature side was getting the material, but we never worked with each other.
Right.
So basically,
you don't know how much footage
I didn't
they were
watch the feature
use.
film until I was done editing the documentary.
See. Right. And it makes sense. That's a good, pure way or more organic way, let's say, for you to have made your documentary, not worrying about, will this somehow, how does this talk to that film? It's not really the point.
Yeah, exactly. For me, it's further evidence that it wasn't, I didn't make it in service of watching the feature.
Yeah, right.
That being said, I feel like if you watch the documentary, it really helps your experience of watching the feature.
Yeah. And they must have really leaned on, obviously, Frank was there, Frank Marshall, of course, and Peter Bogdanovich, who was probably a major consultant on the finishing of The Other Side of the Wind.
Sure. And there were a lot of other people. I mean, Joe McBride, the film historian who acts in the movie, who wrote a book about whatever happened to Orson Welles, and Peter himself. And, there were no shortage of people that had kind of ideas. The thing, though, is that Orson told people different things at different times. At one point, he said half the film would be the film within a film. 50% of it. Yeah,
The Other Side of the Wind is about a venerable director who is, I think you mentioned this before, in the meta side of this, and he was unable to finish a film, which is
also called The Other Side of the Wind.
The Other Side of the Wind,
which is kind of a Antonioni parody, I guess, in a way.
I see.
No dialogue. This kind of beautiful existential play of this man following this woman,
right?
Which I think is actually more based on Model Shop, the Jacques Demy film. Yeah.
So, where were we?
It's the problem with the layers within layers. It's like a Matryoshka doll trying to get through
right.
all of this.
Okay, so we were talking about Peter and Frank. What I appreciated about the documentary you made was also kind of setting certain records straight. And for instance, there was Peter Bogdanovich, who was originally cast in this to play a young kind of goofball of
kind of a young hotshot director who's a disciple.
No. Oh, okay. I thought he was.
Sorry. In the very beginning. In the very beginning, he was supposed to play a role like a Joe McBride role. Like a cineast.
Oh, right. And
like
who's
a
following
film critic.
Who's following this older director? Who's
Jay Caniford.
Who's
Jay
Caniford,
older director.
played by
John Huston,
of course. Right. And then that was shifted because they had hired Rich Little, which was just a terrible idea, it turns out, to play a young director who's making a documentary about this. It's crazy. Rich Little knew probably earlier than even he was doing an impression for a while of a competent actor, but it was couldn't keep it going, so he lost that job or he quit. So
I knew this was also an opportunity, for all this footage. I mean, Welles shot for 6 years.
Nobody ever saw that.
And he shot. This is the only, this is the one chance the world was going to get to see a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
The Rich Little performance, and Welles shot something like 100 hours of footage, which for a feature film, that's probably 7 feature films worth of dailies. So there was a lot of stuff that was never going to see the light of day. Yeah. So in a way, it was a chance for us to kind of go hog wild in Orson's dailies and look at his process and look at these other kind of tangents he followed that he never followed up on.
So what kind of team did you have to just...
A lot of editors.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I had two
archive experts?
Well, no, I mean, two editors I work with a lot. Mm-hmm. Jason Zeldis and Aaron Wickenden. And Jason cut 20 Feet From Stardom for me. Aaron cut Best of Enemies and Won't You Be My Neighbor for me. Mm-hmm. So, I had 2 great editors. Mm-hmm. I had a great AE, James Long, and Corellin Madison, our other producer, who was really our kind of hands-on day-to-day producer. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't work. I mean, first of all, having made a lot of archive docs, mm-hmm. It's one thing, like after Won't You Be My Neighbor, where you literally have thousands of hours
of a show. Yeah.
For Orson, we had maybe 200. Mm-hmm. So 200 suddenly feels like not much.
Quite manageable.
You're like, oh, I could watch that in 2 weeks
mm-hmm.
or 3 weeks, of endless watching. But mm-hmm. say, that there was, it was possible to get your arms around it and to digest it.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So that's what happened. You figured it out. Okay. And then out of that is the story that's told of this film within the film. Yeah, and it's also the story about Welles, this last chapter. I mean, he comes back to America in 1970 after years of living abroad and decides to make this film that's a satire. Which is very unlike him, because if you know about Welles, you know that he was very prepared and very specific with his direction, with his script, with everything. It wasn't... This was who's actually asking for improvisation, right? This was greatly improvised, and experimental in every manner.
Yeah, I mean, there were at times he would be very particular about people delivering lines. Other times
they may not know what they were doing, but I guess that's not.
Well, nobody seemed to know what they were doing except for Orson. The one thing everybody agreed upon was that Orson knew, or certainly seemed like he knew exactly what was happening at every mm-hmm. moment. And virtually nobody else did. And even though he had a script, and there was a script for the film, which was rewritten regularly, very few people ever saw the script. Uh-huh. And even the original editors, I know because I talked to them, they were never given the script. They were just told to cut. And in a way, I feel like part of that had to do with Orson's own travails in the past, that he had editors in his mind betray him and side with the producers. I mean, Orson, after Citizen Kane, never worked with a strong producer, and he had amazing editors like Robert Wise, who ended up recutting Magnificent Ambersons, and Orson found that treasonous.
Yeah.
Orson never wanted anybody to have the full picture except for himself.
Right. That's what it seemed like. This was a way of keeping everybody off kilter.
I mean, I talked to one editor who worked on the film, Yves Duchamp, a French editor, that worked on the film for a year. And he said, what he thinks happened in his own case was the moment he kind of figured out what the entire film was and kind of explained to Orson what he thought it was.
Mm-hmm.
When Orson realized he knew what it was, Orson fired him.
Mm.
That
Interesting, right.
That was not okay.
Now he posed a threat, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Did you talk to any of these, have you spoken to anybody who was involved in the film and their feelings about the final product? Did you?
Yeah, a number of them.
Uh-huh.
We all went to Telluride and they
Right.
screened both films and it was great.
And you were
Frank
there.
had a whole group of, they called VISTO was the kind of the acronym that Frank and everybody came up with back then. Volunteers in Service to Orson Welles. And they actually
I never heard that one.
had buttons made and they had T-shirts.
Wow.
And everybody'd say VISTO alert, when Orson needed something, Yeah, volunteers because nobody was being paid. But even at Telluride, it was great because a number of the old VISTO crew came and Frank had hats and buttons made for everybody saying VISTO. And
That's great.
And they loved it. I mean, there was nobody who worked on this film that hasn't been dying to talk about it for 50 years, who hasn't had it on their IMDb their entire career. I mean, it was
Right.
Something, for most of them, it was at the very beginning of their career. I mean, they were all very young people.
Sure, that's right, yeah.
And so it was kind of indelible in all of their minds. And I think the fact that it actually came to light was more, it was like it meant something personally to all of them, just to see it up there.
They were shooting 73, 4?
Well, they shot from 70 to 76.
76, right.
Yeah.
Right, so a good number of them would still be alive, although he had a number of aging character actors
Yeah,
in the
so
film as well.
the actors,
number
many
of
of the
the
actors
actors were older.
passed away.
Yeah, that's
but
right.
virtually the
But the
entire
crew
is around.
Who else would work for nothing?
Exactly.
I mean,
Yeah.
Right, and but he seemed to always manage. What do you owe his ability just to get people to work for him for nothing like that?
I think it was his one
Citizen
of his great
Kane?
powers. But I mean, go back to Mercury Theater. I mean,
Yeah.
he would have made an amazing general. Like he could lead people anywhere. And you see moments like when Orson's kind of talking about chasing accidents, and in our documentary, like Orson could just sweep you up in his enthusiasm and his romanticism and I would have volunteered to go work on his film. I would have loved that.
But I'm guessing you and I just happened to grow up in this one period of time, coming of age, when he was in a series of desperate years of taking whatever he could take in order to make money to finish something like The Other Side. We didn't know about that part of it. We saw him in commercials selling crappy wine or on game shows.
The thing is he often said, as an actor, I'm willing to prostitute myself, but as a director, I remain virginal. That
whatever you got to do or say in order to get by, I guess.
But the problem is, in the public's mind, they didn't see the work; they just saw the acting and the commercials and everything else. So he really had this persona of kind of a has-been at the end of his life. Nobody realized he was even making movies anymore, though he was spent so much time trying to make movies and making movies and shooting parts of movies and writing movies. There were a couple of scripts that subsequently were made that he worked on late in life in the 80s. Big Brass Ring and Cradle Will Rock.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, part of it is trying to kind of bring a new appreciation to late era Welles. That he in a certain way was doing the most avant-garde work of his life.
Absolutely.
At the end of his life.
Right.
And that I find inspiring.
Very true. The guy was clearly still taking risks, and partly that was out of a necessity as opposed to just choice. I don't know. But, it's an amazing career.
Yeah,
right
I mean,
to the end.
where it gets complex is, he's both trying to... He has such a love-hate relationship with it all. I mean, with the business of it. I mean, he moves back to Hollywood to make a movie about how terrible Hollywood is. He gets the AFI Lifetime Achievement Award where he makes an appeal for money and then shows a clip of the movie making fun of the studio bosses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, he constantly wants to curry favor, and then as soon as a hand is offered, he would bite it.
No one could tell him, though, also what to do, right? And
well, he refused to ever give, cede 1 ounce of control. And, there were... I mean, that then becomes kind of one of the central questions of the documentary, which is, was Orson the victim of bad luck or the creator of it?
Oh, I would say both.
Yeah.
In this case, he
Absolutely.
undoubtedly. The one anecdote that I spoke with Josh Karp about it, I just was obsessed with it when I saw it. Was this in your movie? Must be. Where in the documentary, again, it's called "They'll Love Me When I'm Dead," which is actually a line in a conversation he had with Peter Bogdanovich, which is what I want to get to in my anecdote. But it's not an unusual thing that people forget. We talked about nostalgia before and how strong it is, right? That we tend to forget, and we forgive a lot, and have a selective memory about people, especially once they're gone.
Sure.
So that's what he was referring to. They're going to, people will think nothing, and it all came true, of course. The other thing I remember is Welles, for a period of time, lived in Peter Bogdanovich's house.
He did.
While Peter was living with Sybil Shepherd, right? And he had his own area of the house, his own wing or whatever. And there was at one point around that time or right after where he goes on the Johnny Carson show, which is being guest hosted by Burt Reynolds. I talked about this again with Josh. And this is right on the cusp of one of Nickelodeon, yeah. Which was not a success commercially. So and they go on to really almost viciously. I think Burt Reynolds was being more silly and just poking fun, but there was a level of kind of the mean quality to Orson doing that, And then and Bogdanovich is at home watching this his two pals, right? Somebody he's cast in a number of his own movies and his hero.
And then Peter writes a letter to Orson saying, if I needed to know what you thought of me, I tuned in and watched, and I guess I know. And then Orson, in an extraordinarily Wellesian way, sends Peter back a letter with two letters, an envelope with two letters,
right.
One of which saying, "I'm very sorry," and the other saying, "You deserve it.
Yeah.
Take your pick."
Exactly. There it is, the same thing.
And I feel like that's the Wellesian dichotomy of what's the truth? Well, take your pick.
Yeah. Well, my feeling was like for anybody, let alone someone with the ego of the size of Orson Welles's, right, is how difficult it must have been to see Peter's rise.
Well, certainly, I think that's where a lot of that comes from.
Right.
Is Peter becoming a huge success in the 70s and Orson feeling why him and
forgotten.
Not me.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Right. And to some degree not the why Peter, but just why not Orson Welles?
I mean, I think he felt a certain kind of resentment against a lot of young directors with very little experience that were getting big jobs and lots of money to doing things.
Right.
And he saying, well, what about me? The fact that Peter was, the closest and the most loyal maybe stung the most for Orson.
Anyway, it was. I'm glad it all timed out well. As far as They'll Love Me When I'm Dead, right now available on Netflix, as well as The Other Side of the Wind. I don't think anybody listens to this podcast regularly by now can not have seen it somehow or other. Whoever, if you don't have your own subscription, figure it out. Thanks a lot, man. This has been terrific. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Great talking to you.
Same here. And I don't know. We'll meet again maybe on your next project.
Whenever that is.
Okay. Take a break for a minute.
Yeah, right? I would like that.
Thanks, Morgan.
All right. Take care.